Clients have learned to externalize, right? And that's to say that they learn to see the problem as being outside of themselves. And so they will come in telling you, my husband does this, my wife does this, my parents do this, my boss does this. Now again, this isn't going to be every single client, but more or less each client at some point will externalize, and some externalize more than others. And so when a client is in, there is one disorder that we can't treat, and it's the wrong client disorder. Right? So it's when a client comes in and tells you that the problem is really their husband, or the problem is really their kid, or the problem is really their boss, right? We really need to work to clarify, to help the client to know that, we can't really change anybody out there. We can't. We can't change anybody out there. And as long as we place the responsibility for our own emotional life on other people changing, we will be helpless. We will be in despair, and we'll be caught up in an endless cycle of reactivity. We'll be at the whip and whim of however other people want to treat us. The issue is not the other person. The issue is that there's a problematic interaction. And so although the other person does have a responsibility and a hand in the interaction, we can't change them. But what we can help clients to see is that you can change your behavior, in that when you take responsibility to change your behavior, oftentimes the interaction as a whole actually has a different outcome. When one of the things that we're doing consistently and subtly, and in this chapter 5, when we talk about helping clients with their feelings, we'll talk about it, expand on it a little bit, because I think they do a really good job in the book in one of the vignettes that they describe. But after we validate and identify the feelings, and we find this place of stuckness, a simple question that we often want to ask the client is, how would you like to respond differently? And so we're working to enlist the client in solving their own problems. We're not telling them, hey, you need to solve these problems yourself and I can't really help you. We're actually welcoming and stepping in with the client saying, hey, if you could respond differently, what would you want to do? Oh, well, I would want to speak up for myself more. Okay, speaking up for yourself more, what would that look like in this situation? What would speaking up for yourself more look like in your relationship with your boss? And then what we can do is, which is very, very helpful, and I think it's underrated because it's used very poorly across situations, is role play. But role play is incredibly, incredibly helpful. And one of the techniques that we can do is we can sit with a client and say, okay, for example, you be your dad and I'll be your dad and you be you, right? What would your dad normally say? And I say it, and then the client responds as they normally would, right? So we get a sense. And then we say, okay, let's switch roles. I'm going to pretend to be the you that's standing up for themselves in the way that you'd like. And then the client, and they know what whoever it is, let's say dad is like, oh, you have to do this, X, Y, or Z, right? And then I can actually role play, Dad, when I was really young, it made sense that I had to do all these things for you because I was living under your roof. But now I'm actually a man, and I'd like to help you, but I can't drop everything to show up at your door as soon as you need something. I'd like to be able to help you, but I need a little bit of a heads up first because I have a family of my own, and I need to be able to make sure that my responsibilities are taken care of. And a lot of times clients will go like, oh my gosh, I would love to be able to say that. And so we simply say, okay, let's switch roles, let's do it again. And then we have I role play as the dad, and they role play as themselves. And when we find the words, when we actually say the words are much easier to find when we're in those moments. When we're in that moment of heightened anxiety, it's like everything disappears. So if we can help the client by reciting those words, you'll find that they'll actually find them much more readily in those interactions. One of the other things that can be really, really helpful is we can give the permission, say like, now I want you to be your dad on a really, really bad day, right? And like, give me hell. Like, give me, you know all the strings that your dad would pull with you to try to rope you into doing something that you don't want to do. Let me have them. And I'm going to respond in a healthy way, right? A lot of times that's simply slowing down. A lot of times that's simply saying, hey, I don't have all the answers for you right now, Dad, but I know that right now I'm not available. But when we do that, we're helping the client in solving their own problems. And so in resolving the client conflict, there was an excellent vignette on Anna, who had a dream. And she came in, and one of the big issues that she was having with her family is that she wasn't, she had no autonomy, right? She had no freedom. She came in and was talking to the therapist about her interaction with her parents. And she said, "Oh, I had this dream. What does it mean?" And immediately, the therapist, do you guys remember in the chapter, what did the therapist jump to do in that vignette with Anna in the last chapter? He interpreted the dream. He said, "Oh, this is what it means. The horse had its legs and the horse lost its legs. That's what it feels like for you to be losing your autonomy and not to be able to go where you want in your relationship with your parents." And so what happened? What was the interpersonal process that was happening there?
He was taking away her autonomy by interpreting it for her and saying this is what it was about.
Exactly, right? Behaviorally, he was taking away the autonomy. He was saying, "Anna, I have all the answers, and you have to listen to my wisdom if you're going to make it out of this situation right." They gave on an example later on of saying how that dream could be interpreted to say, like, "Well, Anna, like, what do you think the dream meant?" And we're not eschewing responsibility. We're not hiding from the client. We're not vacating the room, but we're creating space consistently and inviting the client. We're saying, actually, this is a place where I want to change the process so that you can find your own voice. The way that clients resolve their problems will be much more meaningful and helpful if it's the clients coming to them themselves. Because the reality is all the advice is out there. And they've probably heard it a million times before. But they're not able to enact it. It's because it's not theirs. And so what we want to do is help the client to make those resolutions their own. And so here we're going to be shifting into tracking anxiety. So anxiety serves as a signpost that points to the very heart of the problems. It's a signal that a real threat or danger is present. And so when we track anxiety, it helps us to become aware of what exactly is the key concern here. When we notice the client getting anxious, when we notice them tightening up, when we notice them starting to fidget, when we notice them just kind of like turning into a balled fist, we want then to help the client to focus inward, to become familiar with their anxiety. So there's this 4-step process. First, before that, we are building the working hypothesis. And what we're looking at is, why do certain situations cause this client to be anxious? And how has the client learned to cope? We're not asking this question of why, but we're investigating it for ourselves. So when anxiety shows up, our working hypothesis, which is our fundamental understanding of what's the core treatment issue here, we want to ask, okay, what in this moment that's happening between me and the client, or between the client and themselves emotionally, what is leading to the anxiety? And then we want to examine, how has this client learned to cope with the anxiety? I told you guys of the gentleman that I've been working with. I told you guys last class about the gentleman that I'd been working with, where we'd kind of developed this teacher-student dynamic, right? You guys remember that? Kind of like a mentor-mentee. And noted that I think that's actually a really helpful dynamic in many ways. But the problem with the dynamic is that it's a helpful version of the same dynamic that he has with his dad, which is, I tell you what to do, and then you do it. And so I actually did. I did exactly what I told you guys I was going to do. And I brought it up to him at the beginning of session. We had session yesterday, and I said something along the lines of like, hey, I want to talk about our work together. I think we've been able to help you a lot, but I think there's kind of a teacher-student dynamic that's helpful at times, but it seems to pretty much characterize our work. Like, it kind of seems like this is the pattern that shows up in our sessions no matter what. And I said to him, I think if we keep doing that dynamic, it's not going to be as helpful as you might want. And one of the things that he actually brought up as I said that was he said, yeah, because sometimes it'll like kind of stop me from going as deep as I could be, right? If it's kind of like, if there's advice and it's helpful, it kind of ends there. There's not a path to greater intimacy. There's not a reciprocity. And then, so one of the things I came back to is I said to him, like, okay, let's kind of clarify your goals, what you want to get here, because I think in order for us to go deeper, in order for us to help you significantly here, we have to be on the same page. And he actually said to me, he was like, okay. He brought up another issue that we talked about last week that I had introduced. And the issue was something like he feels very anxious approaching women. And he said all his coworkers are like, no, dude, not you. Like, you couldn't. Like, you're like cool as a cucumber, cool, calm, copacetic. Like, you're the guy. Like, no way you feel anxious, like, approaching women. And he said, so everybody would be like, you just got to walk up. You just got to do it. And then I explored him. What would happen if you kind of let that anxiety show up here? And then he said again, right, he was like, oh, well, we're supposed to be setting goals today, so I don't want to take us off in another direction, right? That is an interpersonal process, right, where he's wanting to defer to me to say, JP, you said we should set goals, so I don't want to talk about this thing that's burning on my heart that's really difficult for me right now. I want to talk about your agenda. And so I said to him, I said, hey, we can talk about goals next week. I do think it's really important for us to clarify and set goals, but I can also see that what's most important for you right now is this issue. So maybe we can talk about this issue, and maybe we can just have a mind for how it might fit into your greater goals. But let's go into this issue. And the anxiety started to show up. His legs started really bumping and kind of said, like, can we let it show up here? And he said, yeah. But then he started talking to me, and he started explaining why he was feeling that way. He started telling me all these things, and I said to him in a moment, I said, you feel really far away right now. And then he kind of said, oh, like, I'm sorry. And he put his head down. I could see there was like a little bit of shame there. And then I asked him, I was like, what's happening right now? And he kind of started again telling me about why he was feeling anxious, like giving me this explanation. And again, I said to him, I said, like, I feel, and I use this analogy, I said, what it feels like right now is that there's like a beautiful painting, and you're standing between me and the painting, telling me about the painting. Like, you know this painting so well, and you're standing here saying, like, JP, the painting's like this, and it's like this, and it's like this, and it's like, but man, I can't see it. Because this part of you that's trying to explain it all to me is actually in the way. And then he talked about everything just, I can feel the anxiety in my chest, but everything just gets filtered. Everything gets filtered. And then later on he told me, I feel like I have to tell you why I'm anxious. Like, I feel like, and I said, what would happen if you didn't? And he told me that when he was younger, when he was playing sports, he played baseball. And he said he would stand up to the plate and he would be really scared because people were throwing fastballs and it hurt to get hit with them. And he said, if I told my dad that I was scared, he would say, what did you expect? He would say, well, if you're scared, you can't play. There was no room for anxiety. It was, well, if you can't get over it, you can't play. And so for him, if he was to feel anxious about getting hit with a baseball, which sucks no matter how used to it you are, he would be disconnected from his dad, and also the very thing that he enjoyed most in his life would be threatened to be taken away. And I asked him, this part of you, what's this part of you nervous might happen if you felt anxious here? And he said, well, I have to come up with some reason, even if it's not true. I have to find a reason, because that's what I had to do with my dad. I had to tell my dad, Oh, well, I don't want to strike out. Oh, I don't want to disappoint my coach. Oh, I don't want to hit a grounder and not be that good. And he said to me, he said, sometimes those things were true, but most of the time they weren't. And same thing was happening with me. He was telling me trying to find all these reasons. And we just kind of said, we were like, it sounds like you just weren't allowed to just feel scared. And I was like, how are you feeling right now? He said, I'm just scared. And I said, yeah, it's just scary. And something I said to him that it just really connected for him. I said, it is scary, but you can do scary things. And that was a corrective emotional experience because it was something totally different. The different experience, the problematic experience is you can't be scared to do hard things. You have to just do them, right? You just have to push through. You just have to walk up to this person and say hi. You just got to ignore those feelings. And that happened over and over and over in his life. And the reality is when we shifted the dynamic, when we made a process comment to explore the relationship, when we tracked the anxiety, why is he feeling anxious? Well, he's feeling anxious because what he's doing is scary. Secondarily, he's feeling anxious because if he lets his anxiety be there, I might judge him or reject him. How did he learn to respond to this anxiety? By finding something in the world that could justify it and tying it to that so that he could protect himself from rejection. When we saw why he was feeling anxious and how, he and I were able to change the interaction. It was actually probably one of the most powerful sessions we've had in probably the last 6 months that we've been working together. And so when we become aware of the dynamics, we name them, and then we can make sure that we're not repeating the same problematic dynamics in the first place. And so the 4-step process for tracking anxiety is to identify, approach, observe the trigger, and then focus the client inward. We want to identify it for ourselves, right? So I could notice that he was feeling anxious because he was kind of, moving his leg, and he told me that too. We have a very good rapport. But then the key is we want to approach it directly. We don't want to go around. We don't want to be scared to approach it. We want to say, it seems like there's a lot of anxiety in the room right here. We want to go straight towards it. Yes, Mina?
What if you approach it and the client shuts down?
We approach that. So what might be an example here? If I say, oh, Mina, you seem anxious. You seem nervous right now.
No, that's not true.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood. Bring me in. What's happening for you?
What if they say, I don't want to talk about it?
Okay. I don't want to push you to talk about anything you don't want to talk about. But I'm curious, what would happen if you did talk about it here with me? What's the risk? Yeah, you'd be vulnerable. It'd be a big risk to be vulnerable. What's it like for you to be vulnerable in front of people? What happens?
I might see you.
You might see weak. And weakness, like, what does that mean? What does it mean if you're weak?
It's a sign that I'm giving people control over me.
Yeah. Well, Mina, I don't want to control you. I don't want to make you do things that you don't want to do. And so I'm glad you're letting me know that this isn't feeling super great with you, like right now. But maybe you being weak here with me could turn out differently than those other situations. If you would be open to telling me about the other situations in which you've been vulnerable and weak and you've been controlled by other people and that's felt lousy, I can understand that a little bit better, and I can reverence that by trying really hard to work with you so that that same thing doesn't happen here. Because what I am committed to is making sure that what happens here is actually helpful, and it's the type of interaction that you want. if you were weak with me, how would you want me to respond? You don't know. That's okay. That's okay. I think for me, when I'm weak, really one of the biggest things that I want is just the space to be there. And I want to know that I'm not going to get rejected or pushed away, that people are willing to be in that weakness with me. And I've experienced that with other people. They've given me that great gift, and I think that we can create that same thing here. And so it takes you, right, to the most salient issue, the core struggle, right? Perhaps the core struggle isn't anxiety, it's the fear of being controlled. But when we approach anxiety, it triggers the fear of being controlled, right? So there, we identified it. I'm afraid of being weak. We approached it directly. Oh, what does being weak mean? What would happen here? What would happen if you're weak? And then exploring the trigger, right? For me, I'm saying, oh, okay. Vulnerability is the trigger to being controlled. And then focus inward, right? Mina, what's it like for you when you feel controlled? I wouldn't want it to happen, but what would it feel like if you were controlled here? Right? Any follow-up? How would that feel for you?
Me?
Mm-hmm.
Like as a client or as a
Mm-hmm.
therapist?
Yeah, as a client, yeah.
Being controlled?
Mm-mm. This interaction that you and I just had.
Nerve-wracking?
Why is that?
Because I wouldn't be expected to perform, be on the spot.
Yeah, right. So, well, thank you for allowing yourself to be on the spot. But it highlights, right? Each of us is going to have a different reason that we don't want to go there. It's going to be hard for all of us for one reason or another. But if we can be curious about why people don't want to go there instead of being forceful, people will reveal to us, and as they reveal to us, they find and they come to know their own story. And what we do is we say, hey, there's an unwanted but expected response that you have right here. I want to disconfirm that. Not by telling you, oh, I'm not going to judge you, but by showing you. Sometimes that means saying it, but most of the time it means just showing it. Yeah. In the resistance, right, we want to understand the original pain. Right? So when there's resistance, oh, I don't want to be weak. We want to understand what's the initial pain that's triggering that resistance to being weak right here with me. And we want to appreciate, okay, that was once really helpful. There's probably relationships where it's really helpful for you not to want to be weak. But then we want to disconfirm and explore alternatives. Maybe it could be different here for me. Maybe it could be different here for you. Maybe this could be something that resolves rather than repeats that painful scenario. When clients become anxious, it's about the things that hold real meaning for them. One of the easiest ways to approach this is just to say, what are you feeling right now as we're talking about it, right? We're bringing it to immediacy. We don't want to escape. We don't want to say, oh, well, maybe there's a lot of ways we could escape that I can't think of right now. But we want to be bold, but also sensitive in approaching it directly. A lot of times I say to clients, especially when we're talking about trauma, I say to them, I want to be really sensitive to what we're talking about because I know it's really raw and difficult and painful. But I also want you to know that I'm not afraid of it. And so I want you to know that like I'm stepping here lightly, not out of fear, but really just out of a desire to be reverent. So we're letting clients know that we do care, but we are also, with that care, being bold, and we're continuing onward. And so when we are observing what triggers the anxiety, right, there can be process, well, we'll go content and process. So the content might be that we are talking about something that's sensitive. There's an issue that's discussed that's difficult to go into. But the process that precipitates the anxiety is the fear of what's happening between the therapist and the client, right? So Mina, you just said it. I wasn't ready to be put on the spot, right? Like I felt nervous about that, right? So the thing part of what was creating the anxiety was a fear of a problematic process occurring. And then again, we're always coming back to focusing inward, helping the client to be more familiar with the internal landscape of their own world. We want to use process comments to change the interactions. And then we want to link their new behavior with us, with the therapist, to others in their life to say, okay, maybe if this went well here, maybe it could go well other places as well. And again, I love that quote at the end of the chapter. Our therapeutic stance is not, I know, I'll tell you. Our therapeutic stance is, you know, you tell me. And our work is to actually create the space where the client believes that that's wanted, desired, and respected, and welcoming them into that. Great. Any questions on the internal focus or this section of tracking anxiety? No. And if there are any questions while my back is turned, you can just shout them out. Okay, so here we are, helping clients with their feelings. Fun stuff. So the kind of conceptual overview. We facilitate change by providing a more helpful response to the clients with their feelings than with others. And we seek to validate them and take them seriously. I want to begin with this introduction here on page 143 because I think it just hits the nail right on the head, which it should because it's the introduction of the chapter. So, Jeannie, a first-year practicum student, was off to a good start with her client Sue. However, at their third session, Sue entered in a crisis. "I have breast cancer," she cried. "My doctor says I have breast cancer." With undisguised anguish, she went right to her biggest fear. My girls may not have a mother to help them grow up. Taken aback by the intensity of this raw emotion, Jeannie didn't know what to do at first. Thinking of what she could say, Jeannie jumped in and began doing what she had always done best: getting the facts, making plans, solving problems. Have you gotten a second opinion? Have they talked to you about your treatment options yet? They can do so much more than they used to be able to. Chemo has become so much more effective. The next day in supervision, Jeannie's supervisor tried to help Jeannie see that she had moved right into problem solving and reassuring mode without responding directly to Sue's profound fear. So the supervisor commented, "Such big feelings, Jeannie. Such vulnerability." It sounded like you wanted to help Sue figure out what to do. Instead, what do you think would have happened if you had tried to stay with her feelings longer? Jeannie was rather quiet and vaguely suggested that she wasn't sure how to be able to do that in the future. How to be able to do that. Her supervisor tried to be more specific. "I'm thinking of several ways you might be able to do that in the future, like expressing more directly your own compassion and concern for her, or perhaps helping her clarify or name her feelings so overwhelming, or maybe just affirming how frightening all this is right now. I think the sequence is important here. If you respond to her feelings first with this type of understanding or empathy, I think then she could be better able to use your suggestion about what to do," right? And here the supervisor's seeing that Jeannie's saying, "I got to help her," right? And supervisor's even saying, "Well, if you really want to help her, if that's your agenda here, the first thing you need to do is empathize." As their discussion unfolded, however, Jeannie disagreed and said, "The client wasn't ready to go that deep yet. We haven't been working together long enough to push her into feelings like that." Jeannie looked puzzled as her supervisor replied, "But you weren't pushing her to go deeper than she wanted to. Sue initiated this. She brought forth these feelings to you. It was new and too much for Jeannie to absorb now, but by the end of her practicum year, Jeannie had become better at letting the clients feel what they were feeling." And this so often is the crux for us. We are not able or willing to withstand the distress that our clients are feeling. We aren't ready or willing to withstand the distress of, this person's telling me that they might die. And we repeat the same problematic pattern, which is to say, let's get the hell away from this anguish and let's find a solution. The fundamental issue here is, my world is falling apart. She said, I'm terrified that my little girls won't have a mother to take care of them as they grow. It's a profound suffering. It's a profound fear. It's a great challenge, but it's also so liberating to just be able to sit there and say, the world is falling apart right now. And this news has the impact to change everything in your life. We aren't forcing the clients into feelings. We're allowing them to be with what they're bringing up. And then we are facilitating their entering into those feelings in a helpful way. And so, when we try to problem solve, when we try to provide reassurance, they have so much better treatments now. We miss the core issue, which is that this is an inevitable fact of life. We don't have control. And inevitably, we're going to face loss, confusion, and crisis. There is no problem solving that can fix all that. Maybe there are some solutions at times. But that fact, we can't avoid. But we don't have to. If you believe that your role as a therapist is to make clients feel better, you will try to do just that. But the issue is not that clients feel bad. It's that they have not been allowed to both feel bad and be connected to somebody in a relationship of trust and care. And that's what we're seeking to provide our clients. And so I linked online a meditation. It's called Stepping into Sadness. It's about 20 minutes long. It's a mindfulness meditation. It'll begin with about 10 minutes of just a breathing exercise. And then it will ask you to think of something sad. And it'll ask you to become familiar with the sadness and let that sadness emerge. And I really want to encourage you guys, I would like you all to do that before next class. We'll talk about it a little bit more deeply next class. But I think that we can do the very thing in our training programs that this client is talking about right now. They're not ready to go there. That's too big. That's too serious. And so as therapists in training, we can sit down and do role plays, which can be helpful. And we can talk about things that aren't that important to protect vulnerability, right? And indeed, we should honor our personal history, and we should have an honor and a sense of protection for the stories, especially that involve others. But my hope in this class is to invite you guys to push through that a little bit farther, right? The experiential aspects of this class are really important. And to recognize we have to be willing to do the work ourselves. If we can't do the work, we won't be able to guide the clients in doing that same work. So in this experiential exercise, you are trying to feel sad. That's the point of the exercise. You're trying to feel sad, but what you're seeking to do is to hold that sadness in a little bit of a different way. Rather than either totally avoiding that sadness and pushing it away and resisting it, and also rather than getting so overwhelmed with the sadness that you get rushed down the roaring torrent and smashed along the rocks and the rapids, what this exercise is inviting you to do is something different, which is to say, okay, I can both be connected to the emotion and also not overwhelmed by it. It's the realization that you are not the sadness. The sadness doesn't define your whole being, but rather you are the space in which the sadness emerges. Oftentimes clients will, at certain points or certain times, do things like this, and they'll kind of draw a picture of themselves, right? And they'll say, okay, this is the sadness, this is the anxiety, there's a war between these two, this is my history and my trauma. And then they'll say, and then there's me stuck in the middle. And what I say to them is like, this isn't you. This is you. Right? This is your self-image. This is who you believe you are. But it's not your identity. Who you believe you are can never really be an identity, because as soon as it becomes an identity, it's no longer you. It's a picture. Maybe a picture of you. This is a picture of you. But you are not the one who just experiences all these things and holds them. Like, you're the whiteboard. And so you are the space of awareness in which everything emerges. And when we can rest as this space of awareness, which is what the mindfulness exercise is about, it doesn't really matter how big the sadness is, right? Because we still have space to hold it. And so it's a practice, because what we do as therapists is we provide containment. We provide a space. I say this often. This room, this relationship, we can hold whatever shows up. Sometimes at the beginning of therapy, I say to people, especially who seem very hesitant, I say, okay, I want you to take a moment and I want you to think about all the things that you think it would be inappropriate to talk about here. Come up with that list. And then let's start at the top. Like, let's put that on the table. And oftentimes I do that more of a thought experiment rather than kind of diving right in. But it's to say, like, hey, there's nothing that we can't hold here in this space. That doesn't mean that I am going to fix it all or that I'm a superhero, but I really believe that as two people, like, we really can stay connected to it all and hold it all. That's what people don't experience with their feelings, that they can both be connected and also in pain. They experience so oftentimes that when I'm in pain, my caregivers disconnect from me. So in order to stay connected with their caregivers, they disconnect from their pain. We are working to establish something different, to say, like, hey, I can be connected to you when you're hurting. And so our clients have great ambivalence. This theme of ambivalence comes up, and it will come up, and it will come up, and it will come up, because you're gonna face ambivalence all the way down. And ambivalence is mixed feelings. How do we help clients in working with ambivalence? We don't avoid them. The feelings, the ambivalence. No, don't feel. Nope, don't say don't feel. Don't avoid. Huh. When we avoid the feelings of ambivalence, the feelings of fear, our therapy loses its meaning and vitality, and it just becomes an intellectual pursuit, right? It just becomes sitting around and saying, well, why'd that happen? How'd you get here? What went on? And it all happens up here. We especially in the West, especially in the States, we live in our heads and we're disconnected from our bodies and from our experiences. And we want to work with the whole person to help connect, right? The mind, it's a great tool, but a lot of times people try to think themselves, and you can't think yourself out of a feeling problem. And so we are working to facilitate the connection. A lot of times clients, they have a deep desire to be known, but also a great fear. The desire is, I hope this person will respond to me in a different way from what I'm used to being responded to. But the fear is that, but they might not. And that might not be worth it, right? Like Mina, like you shared, right? I don't want to be vulnerable. I don't want to be controlled, right? The hope is, of course, man, I would love to be in a relationship where I'm not controlled and where I'm treated with mutuality and respect and where my voice has a space. But the fear is that this is just going to turn out like the too familiar story. And so, as Nick said very well, we can provide new ways of coping. We can provide behavioral alternatives. We can help clients to reframe. But those things are only so helpful. They only go so far. We need to address the feelings of conflict directly. What's far more valuable than providing the kind of knickknacks, paddywhacks of problem solving and tools, right? Those kind of helpful like coping skills, is for the client to be seen and for the client to be safe. And so one of the keys here is that in order for the client to change, the fear schemas have to be activated. Who here has said something along the lines before of, I know I keep doing this thing, and I know why I do it, but I just don't know how to stop? Who here has had that experience, right? Yeah. See everybody's hands up. When intellectual insight becomes disconnected from emotional insight, we get ourselves into a rut. And so we can't change. We have these schemas of, you'll hurt me, you'll abandon me. The part of you that knows that you have that schema is different than the part of you that has that schema, that framework, right? The part of you, for example, right, this young man I was working with, he was telling me there's this part of him that knows that he's anxious. And I said to him at one point, I think the part of you that's telling me about your anxiety is stopping you from actually sharing your anxiety directly and letting me connect with you, right? He knew about the painting that he was showing, like all back here. And so that part of him that could tell me the whole system couldn't fix the issue, because the part of him that holds the pain and the difficulty and the fear is the problem. That's the part of him that needs a different experience. And so in order for clients to change their schemas, their expectations of others, the faulty schemas and the fear patterns need to be activated. And this is why so often we're striving for immediacy in the here and now in therapy. Because if we talk conceptually about making changes, it doesn't make changes. It actually typically just exasperates clients even further. And they feel like, we've been talking about this for weeks and nothing's changed. I'm feeling frustrated. I thought therapists were supposed to help you. I thought you were supposed to be able to tell me what to do, doc. Whatever it is. And so we need to help clients to experience a safe space so that their fears can be activated, so that this client can say to me, Jean Paul, I know I have a lot of trust for you. I don't think this would actually happen, but I'm also terrified that if I'm anxious here, you'll ask me why, just like my dad, and I won't know what to say, because all I feel is anxiety, and I don't know the reason. When that's happening, that's not him explaining the situation to me. That's him allowing the fear schema to speak directly to me. And when the fear schema emerges, I can work with that part of him and provide a corrective emotional experience. Yes, Nick?
This question kind of just came to me, but have you ever had this experience where someone already opens up like super quickly and you don't have to dive in? You don't have to like push
Yes.
for the anxiety. Like,
Yes.
is that like that just makes the whole situation easier? I'm assuming.
No.
Does it?
It doesn't. What type of interpersonal style and pattern might lead somebody to show up and just share everything?
Someone that is either pushed by other people to go to therapy, or someone that is
Yeah, both, right? And especially maybe not somebody who's pushed to go to therapy, but somebody who's always pushed to perform, right? Athletes, a lot of times, especially, athletes a lot of times will do that, right? Because there's a certain kind of aspect of training, I think, that's just in the athletic world that's like, hey, we got to go to the gym, we got to do the workout, like we got to do the preseason work. So people rush in, they'll just dive in, right? But the issue is, we talked about ambivalence. Clients aren't aware of their own ambivalence. So one part of them is sharing their deepest, darkest secrets. And another part of them is saying, you idiot, this guy's just going to hurt you just like everybody else, right? And so if we just stay with that, right, as a therapist, it could be really easy to say, oh, this is a good client. They're going to the emotion if we have an agenda to go to the emotion. But what could actually be happening is they're saying, I need to perform for the therapist. What you do in therapy is go into the feelings. So I'm going to go straight into the feelings, and I'm going to stay there. And that's actually a dangerous thing for them to do, right? Because if they just have this sense, oh, you should just trust authority automatically. And then they go to someone who's in authority, and they open up. They're actually in a profound space of vulnerability where that authority figure, if they're not holding their authority as they should, can take advantage, manipulate, and control that person in a really painful and problematic way. So when people share like that, oftentimes I would make a process comment. And what might the process comment be? I'm bringing the implicit interaction, the unspoken interaction, to the surface explicitly. What might the process comment in that situation be?
I feel like I'd say something along the lines of, we're moving up really fast here. It seems like you're trying to say one thing, maybe, like you're just trying to say these things way too quickly. And I was gonna say like, it seems like you're trying to hide something, but then that would be like blatantly saying something, and that would make the client shut down.
Yeah, so soften that up about 80% and try to say it again. And simplify, less is more.
You're talking really fast, or no, that's.
There's a little bit blaming,
Yeah.
a little criticizing.
We are moving very fast here.
Yeah. Wow. Feels like we're moving really, really fast here. I know there's this part of you that really, I'm so grateful you trust me, that you're sharing this all with me, and I reverence this. But I'm wondering if you have any mixed feelings about coming in on this first session and sharing all this with me. Yeah, actually, I feel really nervous. But I feel like this is what I have to do to get help. Right? And then I have the opportunity to say, like, I think it is important for you to go to some places of vulnerability in here to get help. Taking risks here is actually going to be a core part of our work together. But it can be at your pace. And you can share as much with me about this or as little as you want. And honestly, I'm actually probably most interested and concerned here that you're telling me that there's a part of you that feels like you have to share everything with me and a part of you that doesn't want to. Because that is far more likely to be the client's core issue than the content of the feelings. That they have a part of them that shares everything and a part of them that says, you crazy person, that's going to end up with you being more hurt. Probably because it has in the past. Excellent question. Yeah. And so we provide a corrective emotional experience when we allow clients to share those important feelings with us while we can remain connected and validate their emotions. When we do this, it loosens those schemas. It changes those maladaptive ways of looking at the world and helps them to see that, okay, maybe other people can respond to me differently as well. One of the things that the interpersonal theory holds is a little bit different than a kind of common notion of feelings. And it's not to completely dismiss the common notion, but typically we can assume that clients avoid the feelings because it's just too much for them, it's just too big for them. But what our theory holds is that rather than the clients being afraid of being overwhelmed or the feelings being too much, what they're actually afraid of is the interpersonal consequences. So clients avoid feeling because of unwanted interpersonal consequences. What might some of these unwanted interpersonal consequences be? You can just shout them out while my back is turned. Shame. Judgment. What else?
Weakness.
Now, was that second one? Losing control. Yeah. Shame and weakness. You're speaking to the experience, but how might those be unwanted interpersonal consequences? What you're speaking of is intrapersonal consequences, right? The interior experience. But what's the unwanted interpersonal consequence of being weak? What might happen?
Judgment.
How? How are you vulnerable?
Because you're exposing yourself, which makes it easier for other people to get to you.
Yes. Yes. And as you said as well, mean a judgment, right? So rather than being afraid that the feelings will be too big, the interpersonal theory holds that primarily clients are afraid that if they share, they'll be hurt, not by their own feelings, but by the reactions of the other person. And so there are expected responses, but they're unwanted.
What do you mean by expected responses? Expected from who?
When we were speaking a few moments ago, what did you tell me that weakness would mean? Control and shame. And here, if you're weak, who would be controlling and shaming you?
My classmates and you.
Exactly, right? So it's not so much, oh, I would feel bad, right? But it's, I don't want to be shamed. The expected response is, you're all going to shame me and control me. John Paul, you're going to shame me and control me. So that's the expected response, but it's also unwanted. The same responses of fear, shame, guilt. Resistance and defenses are protecting us against those unwanted interpersonal consequences. And so it gives us a real space there, right? And that's why we can pretty much always ask this question, what would happen if you felt ashamed in front of me? We can ask, is there a way that you would expect me to react, but you would really not want me to react here if you allowed me to see your vulnerability? And so we don't want to just push through the defenses. Because when we push through the defenses, we do the same thing that this client is doing, Nick, that you kind of shared. This client goes straight in. They're pushing through their defenses, but in a way that's unmodulated, in a way that's unbalanced. And they're actually putting themselves in a space of profound vulnerability. We really are not trying to push clients into feelings. Our goal is not to make clients cry. Our goal is not to make clients cry. Our goal is not to make clients feel the feelings that they don't want to feel. Our goal is to understand and to help the clients understand what might happen if you felt that way. What unwanted consequence would happen if you felt the sadness? How might I react to you if you were feeling the sadness? Yes, Mina?
What if the client wants to feel these unwanted feelings, but is afraid of how? So, like, for instance, let's say they want to feel what they're fearing of and just get it over with, but they're afraid of the outcome of that.
Oh, yeah.
What if someone is used to that feeling so much that they don't know how they will feel without that feeling?
Excellent, excellent. So what are they afraid of there, fundamentally? This happens especially with clients who have a more obsessive compulsive personality structure.
Not knowing.
Not knowing, right? Oh, Mina, you're afraid of the unknown. I mean, that's what I would say in that moment, right? It'd be easy to say, oh, well, you'd be like, right, the ineffective response would be, you'll be great, you'll love it, you'll have much more meaningful relationships. Meanwhile, right, this person's saying, I don't know what my life would be like if I wasn't depressed. What they're telling me is, depression kind of gives me a role. I know how to be a depressed person. When I'm around my family, I know how to do this role. And this role keeps the peace. Because a person's emotional issues are a systematic symptom. They're a symptom of a dysfunction in a broader system, right? Oftentimes, Murray Bowen found that the person in a family that would develop the greatest psychological issues was the person that was the most vulnerable and the most sensitive, right? We can, like a sponge, absorb all the familial issues and manifest them in depression and anxiety and obsessive compulsive disorder. And if we change that way of behaving, we would also be changing the way that we're interacting. So remember, our symptoms and the client's symptoms oftentimes are what maintains ties to the caregiver, right? For example, just broadly with feelings, if my parents cannot hold my sadness and I want to be connected to my parents, what do I have to do?
Suppress that sadness.
Yeah, you have to suppress that sadness, which is to say you have to cut off from the sadness. So if you allowed yourself to hold that sadness, what would that mean?
You'd probably be cut off or ostracized by them.
Yes. Now oftentimes, people are actually more flexible than we think, especially when we become adults, right? A lot of times we expect that our parents will respond to us the same way that they will when they're 5. And sometimes that's true, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes they can actually change. But the fear is that if I connected with these feelings, it would have repercussions in my life, and I don't know if I'd be able to deal with that. There would be so many unknowns, right? Maybe I wouldn't want this job anymore, right? Maybe I wouldn't want to do this role anymore, right? And if I was going to connect with those feelings again, it would actually mean a substantial difference in my life. Yes, please.
If the client has comfort in their depression, are you trying to treat the depression or the comfort they're experiencing through that? What would your first focus be?
Clarifying the core issue. Helping the client to understand how does being depressed, we're wanting to help the client chooses. And so if the client comes in and says they want to work on their depression, we help them with that. But it depends. I'd say fundamentally we want to, affect is primary. So we want to continue going back to affect. But in us going to affect, that resistance will pop up on its own, and then we explore the resistance. We don't have to look for resistance. We go towards the affect, the resistance will pop up on its own, and then we just stay there with the resistance. And so we will pick up on Thursday. Please take time to do the mindfulness meditation, stepping into sadness. Make sure to do that alone in a quiet place where you won't be disturbed. And I will see you guys on Thursday. Thank you.